Hello and welcome to another program in which I'm going to be talking to you about having a better marriage. How do you have a better marriage? Well, as I talked to you last week, I told you about the specific issues that we had dealt with. When you deal with unresolved emotional pain, you're not going to be a codependent, and you're going to be able to be emotionally more mature. This week, I'm going to be talking to you about the whole reality of triggers, how triggers actually cause marriage relationship ruptures. I believe that some people, as I said last week, are really have gotten a divorce or separated. My wife actually left me for 8 weeks because I was triggering after a year and a half of our marriage. So triggers are very, very devastating to a marriage. And then I'm going to be talking to you also about the specific results that can happen in the attachment and bonding area in your marriage. As you might recall, 2 weeks ago, I talked about emotional intimacy, emotional connection. Well, emotional intimacy and emotional connection will cause a greater bond in your marriage. But you must resolve emotional pain in order to get to emotional intimacy, as I said 2 weeks ago. So we're going to be looking at those two things, and it's going to be very exciting for you, so you may want to take notes. But before we do, let me tell you about my book. This is the book, The Key. I wrote this book after discovering from God revelation knowledge of how to heal emotionally. You've got to heal emotionally in order to be able to have emotional intimacy, in order to not be a codependent, in order to not lose out, if you will, by triggering, in order to be emotionally mature and to have bonding. So this is the way to do it. And I also talked to you about emotional healing weeks ago, so you may want to look that up. But you can buy this book on Amazon, and it'll really bless you. I also have a website called relationshipsrevealed.org, and that website will give you some information about these books that I'm writing under the banner or under the umbrella of Relationships Revealed. Thank you. I just had a mind blank there. So anyway, I'm writing these books. This one's on marriage. I'm going to be writing one for parents and children, because if we can get the parents to be able to raise their children properly, then we won't have these kinds of problems. I also have a YouTube channel. It's called Relationships Revealed by Pastor Frank Lewis. So you can look up that, and there's 17, I don't know how many there are right now, 17, I think, videos on there, and you can pick out one that you want to look at and also find out how to resolve emotional pain. Because the whole basis of having a great marriage is resolving emotional pain. The problem, one of the big problems in marriage, is triggering. Triggering is a problem. And the problem is really this. Most people don't even know why they trigger. They don't know what happens when they trigger, and they don't know that unresolved emotional pain is causing them to trigger. Well, that really fits, because most people are perishing in their marriages, not having great marriages, or even having marriages that don't work, divorce. That just messes up kids. I see too much of that, and I don't want that to happen. I made a covenant with God a long time ago that I wanted to change divorce statistics in the body of Christ. Well, I believe this book will help do that. And so what we're going to look at is triggering. Behavioral scientists tell us, and brain scientists, both those groups tell us that if there's something remotely similar in the present that happened to us as children that was painful, it's going to come forward into our brain in nanoseconds. Well, that's a billionth of a second, people. And that is so fast that it's instantaneous. So what happens is when a person is triggered, they're triggered because of the pain of the event that they experienced and because they believe things about themselves that aren't true. Well, God doesn't want us believing things about ourselves that aren't true. He wants us to be more the people He created us to be. And so He wired our brains or designed our brains so that if there's something that we're believing that's not true and there's something remotely similar that happens in the present, we're going to get triggered. Why? It's going to come crashing into our brain and it's going to cause emotional upset. The pain will actually shut down the left side of the brain. I talked about that many weeks ago. And what's going to happen is I'm going to fight, flight, leave, or freeze. I'm going to fight, flight, or freeze. So that's what happens. That's what the behavioral scientists tell us. So what we've got to know is when we're emotionally triggered, we're going to fight. We're going to get angry. That was me, okay? My wife was different. When she got triggered, she would shut down. You may be one of the ones that shut down. My wife would shut down and go to bed when I got angry at her and yelled at her. And finally, she got very frustrated and got angry, touched into that anger that was always there, but she'd never touched into it. And she started telling me, if you get in my face again, I'm calling the police. Well, I didn't want that. I was scared about that, but I didn't know what to do about triggering. Now I know. Now I know what the root cause of triggering is, and I can tell you, one of the biggest problems in your marriage is you'll hit what we call landmines, triggers, things that happened from the past. You would swear they were happening right in the present, like I did. I thought my wife was actually doing to me on purpose, causing me pain. I really did. I thought she was causing me pain. She wasn't, but I thought she was. Why? Because I was emotionally upset. I would go to anger, push her away because I didn't want to feel any of that pain. The other way to do it is you can run away because you don't want to feel the pain. Or you can shut down because you don't want to feel the pain. But the reality to it is the pain is there and it causes emotional upset. Behavioral scientists call it an emotional trigger. So, if there's unresolved emotional pain, there's going to be triggers. And if there's triggers, then you may be thinking your spouse is causing you that pain like I did. I was sure of it. I would have absolutely bet my life that she was causing me the pain on purpose. It's not true. I learned that it's not true. What's true is that if I trigger or you trigger or your spouse triggers, it's inside of them. And what God is wanting to do by the way He designed our brains is get that trigger up so we know that trigger is based upon something I believe that's not true about myself. So I'll deal with it. Now, most people don't know that the trigger really is a gift from God and that the person triggering me, my wife in this case, triggered me, and she was a gift. She was a gift that God used in order to be able to get me more and more healed. The problem is, if you don't know the truth, then you can't be set free. The problem is, if you don't know what's really happening, then you're going to perish for a lack of knowledge. Or your marriage is going to be less than God wants for you, or your marriage is going to be less than you want, or you're going to be divorced or separated. There's only so many solutions to this problem. So we don't want that. We want a marriage made in heaven right here, right now, on earth as it is in heaven. So we want that. So how are we going to get it? We're going to get it by resolving emotional pain. Because when we resolve emotional pain, we won't have as many triggers. But here's the problem. I've got to take responsibility of realizing that trigger is inside of me. It's not my wife that's causing the trigger, not my husband that's causing the trigger. I'm believing things about myself that aren't true. And if I do believe things about myself that aren't true, then what's going to happen is anytime I get something happening in my life. Now, would you think that God, if I'm wanting to grow, I'm wanting to get healed, I'm talking to God, search my heart. You may be doing the same thing. You want to get healed. You don't like the life you're living. Your marriage is not working. You're disappointed. You're feeling frustrated. You're not getting the satisfaction out of your marriage that you want. Well, that's the case in so many marriages that's not even funny. It's really sad. It's quite honestly very, very sad that marriages are not being satisfying the people. The people in the marriage are not being satisfied. They're not being feeling love and acceptance and approval. Things are not going well because why? They haven't done the emotional work. You have to do the emotional work. You have to get this pain that came from childhood, you have to get it resolved. Remember, I told you, the way you get it resolved is you talk about it. You talk about it with your spouse. If you can trust her or him, you talk about it with your spouse. You talk about it with a safe group of people. That's what I talked about when I talked about reparenting. So, you need to get healed. Once you get healed, you're going to have less triggers. That's going to be very, very good. Because triggers are just God's way of telling us that we're believing things about ourselves that aren't true. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to believe things about ourselves that aren't true because it will keep us from being the people that God created us to be. And then we won't be able to do what God created us to do. So we really, really want to understand that your wife or your husband, when you trigger, that they just lit a fuse. It's inside of you. They lit a fuse. And all they did is lit a fuse, and the bomb went off. And I've looked at it many times. It's like it's landmines. You don't know where the landmines are. You know. But God, it knows where the landmines are. And He wants you knowing where the landmines are. And so what He's done is He's designed our brains in such a way is that we will know where the landmines are when we have something in the present that's remotely similar to the past. Well, would God set up something in the present that's remotely similar to the past? Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely He will. Because why? He loves us so much. He doesn't want us believing things about ourselves that aren't true because it will keep us from having a great relationship with Him and a great relationship with our spouse and a great relationship with our children, and it's a mess. So God, if you'll ask Him to help you to know where the triggers are, where the pain is, like David did, search my heart, well then He will do that. But you're going to there's no sense in triggering. He's not going to set you up for triggers. Now, you may have them. You may have them and certainly not know what to do about them, like I didn't know what to do when I triggered with my wife. But what happened is that it drove me to find out answers. It drove me to find out answers that became this book. Because when I had my church for 12 years, I had to have answers for people. But I wouldn't have been trusted by God to have a church if I didn't have answers for myself and answers with my wife. That our marriage actually became better. Because why? Because I knew it was inside of me. She is my gift. And so that is very, very important to look at your spouse who's who's lighting the fuse for your trigger as a gift from God. And it's very important for you to ask God to give you opportunities to have things happen in the present that will cause you to trigger, because that will tell you you're believing lies. And once you get the lies up to the consciousness, then you can deal with them. You can do what? You can talk about them. You can get them out. You can get them accepted and approved. Remember, I talked about that weeks ago. You can get those lies dealt with in a way that they are resolved. Well, that's what it's going to take to have emotional intimacy and to have a great marriage. But that's not the only thing that's going to happen. That's a reward. You're going to have less triggers. And I'm going to tell you, triggering less is a great way to live. I don't trigger much anymore. I really don't, because I've dealt with so many of my triggers, because God's been good to me. He is a good father, and he's been really good to me to have me trigger over the years so much that I had to resolve the triggers, the emotional pain coming from the triggers, and I did. I talked about it. I absolutely made it a commitment to talk about these emotional triggers. I went into the groups that I had started, and I talked just like one of the people. Why? Because I'm not too proud. I'm not standing on any pedestal. I'm not trying to be somebody, being not known. I wanted to be healed, and I didn't care what the cost was. And that's hopefully the way you are about getting your marriage into a place where it is a wonderful, loving, satisfying marriage. But you can't get there without dealing with unresolved emotional pain. The other thing that you got to deal with, that it will actually be a reward for dealing with the unresolved emotional pain and getting it healed, is you're going to be able to have what I talked about 2 weeks ago when I talked about emotional intimacy. You're going to be able to have bonding and attachment. Remember way back when I talked about lack of attachment. And I talked about lack of attachment really causing 3 different types of attachment styles, if you will, that cause people to be less than God created them to be. If you didn't properly attach, you're going to be in pain. If you didn't properly bond, you're going to be in pain. What are you talking about, Frank? I'm talking about the emotional glue that's necessary to be in a relationship with parents that are going to be able to help you to be able to not have so much pain. Well, that didn't happen. Parents don't know what they're doing. And so what they did is they caused us to pain because Satan used them to do that. It's not really the parents' fault. They just didn't know what they were doing. So what happened is we didn't get properly bonded. We didn't trust mom and dad. If mom and dad brought pain to you, are you going to trust them? I have so many people in my groups that tell me I can't trust my parents. I couldn't trust my parents. When you can't trust your parents, what's going to happen? You're going to trust yourself. You're not going to be able to trust God. You can trust yourself. So what happens then is you end up trying to live your life the way you think it should be, and it just creates more and more pain, and Satan is very pleased with all of that. So in order to be able to have bonding and attachment that we didn't get as children, it's going to take some trust. You're going to have to trust your spouse enough to be able to listen to you talk about the problems that you have, or the triggers that you have, or the pain that God's bringing up to you, okay? You got to be willing to do that, but you got to have trust. Where are you going to get the trust? By resolving more and more emotional pain. So you and your spouse are going to have to make a commitment in order to be able to get healing, unless you can get it in a group. Like I do 5 groups a week, so the needs are great, and so I do that for people. I'm going to be doing, more and more of this, getting more and more information out to people about how to be able to do this. But you got to have a willingness in your marriage. You got to want a better marriage so much that you're willing to go ahead and talk about your pain. Because when you talk about your pain, it will get listened to by your spouse. You'll get reflected back to, as I told you, and you'll get validation and then affirmation. If that's done by your spouse, you will have emotional healing. And when you have emotional healing, because you went through that with your spouse, you should see the groups I do. They don't want to leave. They're going through this process, and I have to kick them out of my house. Why? Because they want to stay, because they're bonded. What happens when you get listened to and reflected back to so you know you're heard, and then you get validated so you know you're loved, unconditionally loved, and then you get affirmed, is you're going to end up bonding with the people that are doing that with you. That happens in the groups that I do, the reparenting groups. Well, it can happen with you and your wife. It can happen with you and your husband if you will make a commitment to do the work. Now, if you're going to do this, you cannot tell your husband or your wife what to do. You've got to stay by the rules. And the rules are in the back of this book as rules guidance, if you will, Appendix A. And so you're going to need to have those rules. You can't fix your husband. You can't tell him what to do. You got to just listen. You got to reflect back to him, and you got to validate him and then affirm him. Same with a wife. If you can't do that, it won't work. But if you're willing to do it, then it will work, and you'll have bonding. You'll have bonding. You'll bond. You'll bond in a way you've never bonded before. It'll be so amazing to you that you won't hardly believe that it's possible, because you'll be bonding. You know why you're going to be bonding? Because you're going to be building trust, and you're going to be known. You're going to be accepted and approved for who you are, not what you do. See, most of the way that we were raised is we were approved and accepted for what we did, for the accomplishments we had. Mom and Dad wanted us to they wanted to look good, and they wanted us to accomplish a lot of things. There's nothing wrong with that. Sports, education, whatever. But the problem with it is we weren't loved for who we were. We were loved for what we did. Now, God loves us for who we are. Your spouse is going to have to love you for who you are. And if they can't do that, there won't be bonding. There won't be attachment. We're created by God to bond and attach. That's how it was supposed to happen, from a baby to a toddler to a small child. Parents were supposed to set that up, but they don't know what they're doing. But if it was done properly, parents would actually listen, reflect back, and they would validate their child, and then they would affirm their child. Then they would have a bond with their child. But that didn't happen, so now we're talking about it in marriage. You can do this. It's going to be a phenomenal result, I promise you, because it's going to bring what? Emotional intimacy. And didn't you love the reward of emotional intimacy, where you get to be yourself, you get to be your true, authentic self with your wife or husband, you get to be loved for who you are, you get to be known at a deep level. You don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to manipulate anymore. You don't have to do all the work. You can just be you in your marriage. And then there's bonding. And when there's bonding and attachment, it's going to bring great results. You won't be shut down like a dismissive. I talked about this before. You won't be shut down because you'll be healed enough not to be shut down. Shut down people don't make great husbands or wives. You won't be distracted. What's distracted? You were attached to by your parents sporadically. And that won't happen. Why? Because you've done the emotional work. You won't be disorganized like I was. I didn't know where I was coming and going. Why? I couldn't trust my parents. But see, if you can trust your spouse, then you won't be afraid of your spouse. You'll be able to love your spouse more unconditionally. Husbands will love their wives like Christ loved the church. Isn't that what Ephesians says? Yes, it is what Ephesians says. So the whole key that I'm talking to you about today is this. If you do the work, the emotional work, you get specific rewards. You get rewarded by not having as many triggers. That means you're not living in pain as much. You get rewarded by having bonding and attachment. And that is heaven on earth. To be bonded to your spouse and to be attached to your spouse is what God created us to do, because we're loving each other for who we are, not what we do. And that is very, very important. So by the reward specifically is that you get to have a great marriage because you have done the work to get emotionally well. By what? By confessing your faults to your spouse, one to another, and praying that you might be healed. So that's James 5:16. That's what God set up. And you can have a great marriage by trusting your spouse and doing this work with them, and it's going to be wonderful. You listen, you reflect back, and you validate, and you affirm. That will bring the bonding, and the triggers will already be dealt with because you've dealt with those, because of dealing with the pain. So you can have that marriage that is made in heaven on earth right now, right here, because you have done the work. Get the unresolved emotional pain resolved with your spouse, and then you're going to have a great marriage, and God will bless your marriage, and you will be so excited. You want to tell everybody else you know about your great marriage, and you will tell all the people you know.